Good afternoon. My name is Michael Wilkos. I am glad you're going to spend your lunch hour with us today so we can talk about the census. We've just experienced a really dramatic decade of change, and I think it's pretty obvious to all of us. I think you can do a casual drive anywhere, and you hear comments like this from folks. Like, I remember when this area was cornfields, or, who's going to live in all these new apartment buildings? Or, this area is not really holding up too well. These are things that I commonly hear when I'm out and about in Columbus. And we're going to talk about city and county trends, and I'm going to focus on a few places of dramatic change. Not all the census data is out, so I don't have data yet on children in poverty and new Americans, so stay tuned. That means I get to do another one of these presentations in the not too distant future. And I'm going to make a lot of observations today about how our city has changed, but I'm going to try to temper some of my judgments about that change, but I'm sure it's going to promote a lot of questions for you. Please use the chat to populate those in. We won't really have time today to get to the chat or Q&A, but I certainly would like to hear those comments and can follow up with all of you at another time. So let's put today in some framing. I love this quote from Chicago Tribune writer Sidney Harris, who said, "Our dilemma is that we hate change and love it at the same time. What we really want is for things to remain the same, but get better." So there's going to be lots of numbers and maps, and that means it's going to be a really boring presentation, right? Because it's a census presentation. But no, this is our home, and we need to understand change better so we can make better decisions. And I only get an hour because that's all Lisa Cordes gave me. And so I'm going to go really fast, but you will have access to all the data and the maps in the presentation today. So here are my paternal grandparents. Both of them were from Eastern Europe. They immigrated to the United States to find opportunity. And this is where they lived, in Youngstown, Ohio, in Northeast Ohio, in the industrial belt of our state. My grandfather worked here his entire life. Like many people, they were attracted to good paying middle-class jobs that the Industrial Revolution provided this country. But that all ended in September of 1977, when several thousand steelworkers showed up and their economic fortunes had ended. There were 40,000 steel jobs in the Mahoning Valley, and it really resulted in decades of prosperity. Those jobs are now gone, and the economic future of the residents who live there is very much tied to that future. 10 years after I moved to Columbus, the infamous Jenny blast furnaces were demolished. And this picture went viral as it highlighted the demise of America's Industrial Revolution. Columbus has had a very different trajectory, and I'm going to start the conversation by pointing out a 1991 dark comedy with Ed Begley Jr. and Stockard Channing. It was about a family of insects that lived in the Amazon, and they were disappointed in America's climate changing behavior. And so they took a human form and they came to the United States to dismantle our climate changing ways. In the beginning of the movie, Ed Begley Jr. is looking over census data, and he just finds out that the most statistically average place based on the 1990 census was Columbus, Ohio. And the movie takes place in a fictitious suburb called Median, Ohio. And for the longest time, this was our claim to fame, that Columbus really had nothing interesting about it. Well, that's not really true anymore, because we just went through a period of significant population growth. And in fact, 90% of all of the population growth in the state of Ohio happened in Columbus and our suburbs, with very little happening in the other 78 counties of the state. And if you look at the regional growth, while the population growth of our region has only increased slightly, what did change dramatically is where that growth occurs. And in fact, 70% of all of the growth of the last decade happened in Franklin County. As the demographics of the population growth shifted dramatically, and as the housing typology that's getting built in Franklin County is more diverse, more of that growth is happening inward. And that's really going to be the underpinnings of the conversation today and what's driving so much of this neighborhood change across the entire county. So let's get some numbers out. The city of Columbus is now over 900,000 people. We just experienced the highest growth rate since the 1950s, and it was the largest numeric increase in our history. I'll say that again. It was the largest numeric increase in our history. And a lot of this growth is what's causing this neighborhood change that we see every day when we drive around the community. It is surprising to even me, who likes to pay attention to population statistics, that Columbus's growth rate of the last decade really surpassed that of a lot of Western and Southern cities, cities that have been noteworthy to be significant growth centers for the United States. This is a city versus city comparison, not necessarily a metropolitan region, because some of these other metropolitan regions are growing more quickly, but it is really a testament to what's happening in the city of Columbus that we've become such a national standout. So part of our narrative is we started off very late in the game for this part of the country. And when Columbus was founded as the first place in the United States to be a state capital, we took off relatively slowly. As the city grew around the center of Broad and High, we never really had the industrial powerhouse of the other cities around the state. But what Columbus did have was this tool that was set in place in the 1950s. Local Ohio State professor, Dr. Kevin Cox, published a book just this summer called Boomtown Columbus. And he talks about that the unique tool that Columbus had, where we used our water and sewer to annex contiguous parts of the city to allow our city to grow. And we saw this particular growth starting in the 1950s, where the land area of Columbus started to grow dramatically. We are now at a place where the city of Columbus is 220 square miles. It is in 3 counties. There are 11 different school districts. And we've really had this unwritten policy of not letting any 2 of our suburban communities touch, to really close the city off from its growth corridors. And we now have 5 places, Worthington, Upper Arlington, Grandview, Bexley, and Whitehall, that are entirely inside the city of Columbus. But that annexation has come to a close. And in the last decade, we grew by just 1.5%, but we squeezed 119,000 more people into our existing city. And this is what's caused a lot of growth and housing pressures that we will get into as the presentation continues. Back to Dr. Kevin Cox. What he said is this: the annexation is only legally feasible where a city is contiguous with the land to be annexed. And Columbus in that post-World War II era was exactly in that situation, and we took great advantage of it. And it was that single annexation tool that has really changed the development patterns of all of Central Ohio, but also the politics. When you think of politics of the region, Columbus is much more influential than it's ever been. We see growth of our city happening throughout the downtown region, and these are the projects that really grab our attention. We also see projects proposed for the area behind COSI in the Franklinton area. And we're seeing projects happening on West Broad, East Long Street, Summit in our near downtown neighborhoods. And the scale of projects in both suburban areas and urban areas are now mixed use and dense, and they're larger in scope and scale than what we have ever seen in this community. The growth of our region is obvious. And when you look at what's been happening, the city of Columbus and Franklin County both experienced a decade of more significant population growth than the previous decade. That increase in growth was not felt across the state of Ohio. And when you compare this over a longer period of time, had you gone to a civic booster back in 1970 in Cleveland and explained that Cuyahoga County and Franklin County were going to have a 1 million person population change in their influence, they might have had a hard time accepting that future. But the reality is Franklin County is now the largest county in the state. And while it used to be said if a politician could carry Franklin or Cuyahoga County by 200,000 votes, you could carry the state, that is no longer a true statement, as the political influence of Columbus has never been greater, and the influence of Franklin County, which moved from the 33rd to 32nd most populous county in the last census, we have never been more influential. The other part of our narrative now is that every community in Central Ohio is growing. What you see on this image in orange are the places that grew just slightly slower than the county average of 13.8%. And in blue, you see all of the places growing more quickly. What's important to note about this decade is every single community is growing in Central Ohio. And the high growth markets, which for several decades were always on the northern end of Franklin County, you now see high growth communities on the north end, on the southeast side, in the southwest side in Grove City. And you also see inner ring suburbs like Grandview Heights hitting very high growth rates. All of the communities in Central Ohio are growing, and that has shifted and changed for this most recent census. Across the county, we saw widespread population growth. While the county was up about 160,000 people, you can see in green on this map and yellow all the areas of population growth. I want to point out two areas on the map in red where population loss continued to occur despite this growth spurt. One of those areas is the near west side, essentially from Coastside all the way out to Hollywood Casino, as the west side of Columbus has continued to struggle, mainly with a lot of social issues, which has made that area not nearly as attractive as other parts of the community for reinvestment and population growth. The other area that actually surprised me that showed significant population loss was the area south of Nationwide Children's Hospital, running along Parsons Avenue to the east. Now, on the surface, you might look at those two areas and think people are not interested in the west side and the south side. But the south side is having a very different experience than the west side, as larger families have been getting displaced by single or two-person professional home purchasers, which are resulting in huge increase in demand, an increase in housing costs and prices, but a reduction in population as lower size households are replacing larger families. And that's going to be a narrative that we are going to unpack in several Columbus neighborhoods. If you work in Franklin County government or the city of Columbus, you should really be paying attention to these numbers, because every day when you go into work and you finish that workday, there will be 37 more people in this community than when the day started. And on a monthly basis, it's 1,100 people, or essentially a small village is what we add every month. Or on an annual basis, we're adding the equivalent of the city of Bexley every year to the population of Franklin County. But the reality is, despite a lot of attention about inward growth and neighborhood change, what we actually saw on this census is that most of the county's growth was in greenfield development. And in fact, much of this last decade looked an awful lot like the post-World War II era of suburban development in greenfields located near 270 or beyond 270. There are some specific neighborhoods where there are changes. I believe those changes are going to accelerate, but the great migration back into the city is not nearly as developed as many people think. The other big change for this community is that all of the net growth in the city of Columbus was due to people of color. And all of the net growth in Franklin County was also due to people of color. If you look at the demographics of this community, it becomes very obvious the rapid way in which we are changing. And I don't need to read any of the statistics on this page. But what you can see is that this was a unique decade in that the white population for Columbus and Franklin County actually fell despite significant population growth. Some of this can be attributed to the fact that people are now more self-reflective of their own identity, and people who may have identified with a single racial group are now more likely to identify as other or two or more. And that's an indication of both the demographic change and also how we define who we are as individuals. When you look at the diversity index, almost every single census tract in Franklin County became more diverse in the last decade. That measure went from 50 to 60 overall for the county. What you see on this map are a few places identified in red, north of the Ohio State University, around University Village Shopping Center near Ackerman and 315, a small census tract out by Hollywood Casino on the west side, and some census tracts near Whitehall. What's interesting about those three particular places, that was either due to the result of demolition of units or the fact that those places were incredibly diverse in 2010. And as the demographics of those areas shifted, they became less diverse, but they are still very diverse places. What I think this map suggests is that if you don't have a diversity, equity, and inclusion platform in your organization, in your community, in the work that you are doing, you're probably a little late to the game, because it is now all of our growth and diversity is increasing everywhere in this community. And despite the increase in diversity, we are still very much plagued by incredibly high, what I would call hyper-racial segregation in parts of our community. You can read at the bottom right of the slide what this diversity index, how it is derived, and we will talk about the diversity index in particular places. There are parts of the community getting more diverse at a much faster rate. If you look at this map in the areas of dark red, what you'll see is that the southern portion of Franklin County is pretty homogeneous, but it's also very rural, and there's not a lot of people who live in those census tracts. And as you continue to look at these maps, what I want to point out is that most census tracts have about just over 2,000 people to about 5,000 people. So sometimes you might see an area, say, in the bottom left corner of this map that looks quite large, but that still has the same number of people that might be in a very small area of color near the center of the map. What this map shows is areas such as Grandview and Arlington, Clintonville, Bexley, German Village, and Worthington are still very homogeneous places. There has been a lot of attention over the last couple of years about both racial and economic segregation, and a University of Toronto study identified that with regard to what we would refer to as second-tier metropolitan regions, both Austin, Texas, and Columbus are really suffering from considerable racial segregation. Although it's changing, what is really interesting to acknowledge here is that some of the newer suburban communities, such as New Albany and Dublin, are far more diverse than some of the inner ring and older suburban communities, which really look like and reflect housing policies from decades ago. When we look at the most rapidly growing parts of our community, there are 6 places that stuck out for me. 5 of the 6 are entirely in the city of Columbus. The area in the far top left of this map that shows 114% growth is the area around Hayden Run. It is straddling both Columbus and Dublin. What is also unique for this decade is the fact that 3 of the high growth markets were in greenfield developments, and 3 of them were in existing areas. You see 2 in downtown Columbus, and the one at 92% is the area referred to as 5th by Northwest. That is the 5th Avenue and King Avenue corridor that runs north of Grandview and on the way to Upper Arlington, as we've seen significant mid-rise residential construction happen in that area. This is unique that we're having high growth markets both in established neighborhoods where there is infrastructure, and it is a much more environmentally sustainable area to build in the core of the city where that infrastructure exists. And this begins a trend of shifting population demographics moving inward. But we also saw this in suburban communities. Whitehall is growing for the first time in 50 years as the demographics of Whitehall have also dramatically shifted, and younger families with school-aged children started to move back into Whitehall as this community has begun to transition. Many of this change is due to original homeowners who purchased in Whitehall, who have now both aged in place and needed different types of housing. And as they have moved out of some of that original housing choice, they're being replaced by families with greater diversity and larger number of school-aged children. The other place, which should be no surprise, was New Albany, which was the fastest growing community in Central Ohio, at nearly 40%. And we see dramatic changes throughout the core of New Albany, where this community in just a single generation has gone from a small village to a good-sized city, and will continue to see significant population growth. But it's really downtown that had a change in the narrative. Like every city across the country, downtown living has become attractive to a certain type of demographic that is driven by both convenience and lifestyle. Even in cities like Cleveland and Detroit and Youngstown, which continue to post significant population losses overall as a city, they saw significant population growth in their downtown cores. A lot of this was due to demographic shifts in the country, but it was also due to policy shifts where American cities were trying to encourage this growth to revive their cores. Why is this significant? Because you generally spend 7 times more money where you live versus where you work. And if we're going to have a vibrant downtown with active retail and restaurant and a pedestrian environment, it must be a place where people live. What's interesting about the growth in the downtown core, it also led to growth in many of those adjacent neighborhoods. What we saw throughout the urban core, from 5th by Northwest, the 5th Avenue and King Avenue corridor, down through Grandview Yard, Harrison West, Wineland Park, Italian Village, King Lincoln, and down to the edge of German Village, all of those census tracts were posting significant population growth in an existing area. We added over 14,000 additional people in this zone. And based on the projects that are both planned and proposed and under construction, I think you will continue to see this kind of significant population growth. What it is also doing is it is becoming larger and larger, and it is spilling over into neighborhoods that have not yet seen that kind of growth, moving into Milo Grogan and Franklinton and the Near East Side, where we're starting to see significant pressures around demographic shift and gentrification. So let's move into some of the neighborhoods. A few of the places that I thought showed some of the most dramatic shifts were Linden. Linden is growing for the first time in decades. It has been the attention of significant revitalization efforts, and the One Linden plan, which was adopted several years ago, is guiding the growth with 10 major principles. But what we saw in Linden was a significant change in what's been happening with outmigration since really the end of the World War II era. The growth was not huge, but it was significant in that it shifted. What was more significant for Linden was that 11 out of the 12 census tracts showed population growth, and those range from one that struggled, had very little change, to those that saw significant population growth of over 17%. Now, this came as a big surprise for me, because what you don't see in Linden is construction. And what also happened was Linden continued to lose housing units. In fact, the population jumped over 7%, but the number of housing units in Linden, actually that should be negative 3.7%, or it lost 652 housing units during that 10-year period. This is a unique trend to be growing in population while you're losing housing units. But what specifically was part of the story in Linden was a dramatic decrease in the number of vacant and abandoned housing units. In fact, 39% of Linden's vacant housing disappeared in the last decade as the growth pressures of neighborhoods around Linden, which showed significant growth, really started to spill over, and very low home values became attractive to developers to want to renovate and bring some of that inventory back online. The other part of the loss of vacant housing was the city of Columbus has focused on Linden for some time. There was, in fact, about 400 demolitions, but the number of vacant units fell by 1,100. And while we don't have the data to know that those other 700 units were renovated and brought back online, we know anecdotally and from talking to realtors that we believe that that's in fact what happened. It was also the fact that a number of housing nonprofit organizations have focused on stabilizing the Linden housing stock. And the result of all these efforts was a significant change in the trajectory of where Linden has been heading. The other thing that surprised me, based on the changing demographics of Columbus and the community, is that Linden saw population growth in every single demographic, including the white population. A lot of that was in northern Linden, specifically in the area around Oakland Park Nursery, has a very modest inventory of housing, which is relatively small, doesn't have a lot of architectural detail, was actually a very easy product for developers and home flippers to get a hold of that product, make very modest investments, and see a significant return as housing consumers who are getting priced out of many Northside neighborhoods were jumping east of Interstate 71 for the first time in many decades. As we move further north, I think Northland maybe showed some of the most dramatic changes in our community. All 22 census tracts in Northland showed population growth, and they range from over 4% to 35%. What's significant about the growth of Northland is it was throughout the entire region, and the fact that if you look at the real numbers, Northland added an equivalent population of the city of Bexley within its borders in just a 10-year period. And this is a very significant part of our city. If Northland was its own community, it would be the 6th largest city in the state of Ohio. What's also interesting about Northland's surge in population, it was not due to the fact that there are more housing units in Northland, because the number of units there barely budged. What we did see in Northland was a significant reduction in vacant and abandoned housing. This is a picture of an apartment complex in 2011 on Northtown, just north of Morse Road, near the Tamarack Circle area. And it represented how challenged the housing market was in the first part of the decade, where there was a number of existing housing units in places like Northland that existed, but were offline because the rents weren't really significant enough to justify both renovation and keeping up the maintenance of a housing stock that was starting to age as it got to about 50 years old. The number of vacant housing units in Northland fell by half. Here's that same apartment complex taken today. And what we saw that the number of occupied housing units went up 7%, while the population jumped 15%. And in both Linden and Northland, what we had been seeing for decades was fewer and fewer people living per housing unit. That trend line stopped and reversed itself. We have anecdotal evidence that suggests a couple things. People are living doubled up in places like Northland and Linden because they can't afford rents, so they're living with family members or friends. And we're also seeing demographic shifts, particularly in Northland, where new American families are larger, and then therefore there are more people living per housing unit. When we see the demographic shifts in Northland, you can also see that diversity is really driving the growth of Northland, but it actually grew faster than both Columbus and Franklin County, despite the fact that this was a part of our region that really did not add new units, and the housing stock barely budged. We see evidence of the Northland evolution everywhere. In 1997, the economic census for the state of Ohio reported that the Northland zip code was the #1 zip code in the state of Ohio for retail sales. 10 years later, by 2007, Northland had dramatically fallen way off that list. And 10 years after that, Northland was really back with a very vibrant retail corridor. In fact, an Ohio Wesleyan geographer by the name of David Walker pulled every single business permit issued by the city of Columbus during the 8-year period after Northland Mall closed, and found that of the 180 businesses that started on the Morse Road corridor, the vast majority of those had either an African or a Latino surname. As what we saw in Northland was the chain stores picked up and moved further out, as no longer JCPenney and Sears were located in Northland. There were actually more new businesses started along the Morse Road corridor than what Northland Mall ever had in its peak years. They looked very different than the type of stores that they replaced, But because of the population shifts of Northland, what you saw was an entrepreneurialism and the dollar turning over in Northland frequently. In fact, Northland became far more of a local entrepreneurial center than the short north did in half the time, without really an effort to create a local destination of retail businesses. Now we move to the Near East Side, which has been getting a lot of attention for its shifts. The reality is Near East Side saw very little population growth over the last decade, just a little more than 2%. What it did see was a dramatic shift in the demographics of who lives on the Near East Side. What we saw over the last decade was that the white population of the Near East Side nearly doubled, going from 19% of the total population to 37%. Meanwhile, the Black population of the Near East Side saw a significant reduction from 75 to 58% of the Near East Side. When we define the Near East Side here, because of the way the census tracts run, we're going to go all the way from 670 on the north down to Livingston Avenue on the south, between downtown and Bexley. What we also saw on the Near East Side was a similar pattern to other parts of the city. While the total number of housing units shrank slightly, we saw a significant reduction in vacancies, just like in Northland and just like in Linden, where the number of vacant housing units in the Near East Side fell by over 1,200, a 34% reduction. But if we look at the Near East Side over a longer period of time, a far more interesting pattern reveals itself. In fact, in 1960, there were 53,000 people who lived in that area that I previously defined, and it has shrunk to just 22,000 today. There are debates around density and new construction and around neighborhood change. You hear people say, it's a food desert. There's no grocery store. It suffers from having the lack of neighborhood businesses. A lot of that is due to the fact that there are 30,000 less people living on the Near East Side, and a portion of our city that once comprised 11% of the total population of Columbus is now less than 2%. But the demographics has seen significant change going back to 1940, particularly if you look at south of Broad, as the Black and African-American population for Columbus has been on a steady and rather predictable increase. The area of south of Broad, between Broad and Livingston, has been far more variety of change, from 4% to 40 to 80%. The area south of Broad was a significant center for the Black community for about a 20-year period, and that has experienced now a dramatic shift, and we will expect these shifts to continue. Across the Near East Side, we see examples of properties that sold for very little previously that are now jumping 2, 3, 4, and even 10 times in value than what they had sold for previously. We certainly see it across south of Broad as well. Anybody who knows the Near East Side is concerned about this trend in the neighborhood and the fact that many of the existing residents are now being priced out of the Near East Side. But the Near East Side is caught up in a far larger narrative of racial change because the Black population has been surging in the suburban areas while it has been dramatically decreasing across all of urban Columbus. The Near East Side, the Near South Side, and throughout Linden, as there has been a migration of the Black population to all of the areas you see on this map in green, particularly in the areas of the city of Columbus served by suburban school districts. The center of this change was really in Franklinton. Here's an example of Google Street View from 10 years ago, and that same image, an exact same location of the street taken in 2020, where we see the former Riverside Bradley has been replaced by River and Rich. A 61% reduction in the Black population in Franklinton, but we've also seen significant outmigration of the Black population out of the near northwest side, and certainly areas of the south side along Parsons Avenue, south of Children's Hospital. The Black population, however, is suburbanizing at a very rapid rate. And there were 3 census tracts that are all contiguous in far northeast Columbus on the edge of New Albany. What you see here is Upper Albany West. And the Black population in this area jumped from 875 to 2,800 people, in a significant shift of out-migration to those suburban locations, particularly as we look northeast and east across Franklin County. The reverse of this has been a considerable white population decline in 3 large areas of our community. That would be all of the west side, the area of the east side stretching from Bexley out to the Fairfield County line, and what we've also seen on the northeast side in Northland and northern Linden. And while the white population dropped only slightly, what we saw is a significant shift in the demographics of Franklin County's population base, where now about 40% of Franklin County are people of color. Some specific areas where we've seen the most dramatic change in the white population would be in places such as Whitehall, Eastland, and Northland, where we're seeing both a shift in the diversity index, where in many parts of our community, that diversity index is increasing. What we're seeing in places like Whitehall or Eastland, we're seeing a reduction in that diversity as there's a significant outmigration of the white population from those communities. What we also believe to be true anecdotally is that a lot of this would be an older population that is choosing different housing as they are aging and need different types of housing stock. As they leave those neighborhoods, they're being replaced by a greater diversity of occupants. Despite the reduction in the white population, there are a couple places that were significantly noteworthy because of the large increase in the white population. They were almost entirely in places that had previously been redlined or segregated. The Near East Side, the area where the King Arts Complex and the Columbus Urban League is located, saw the largest increase in white population of any census tract in Franklin County at over 200%. Similarly, in Driving Park and portions of downtown, we saw a movement of the white population into the core as we saw a massive movement of Black residents to suburban areas of the city. What you see in this picture is, again, a Google Street View snapshot of St. Clair Avenue, which is the center of the increase in the white population. What's interesting is that the movement of white residents back into urban core neighborhoods that for many decades, policies had prevented diversity. We're seeing an increase in diversity of those neighborhoods, both in the suburbs and in the urban core. And with the Asian population, while we saw a significant increase in the Asian population as a base of Franklin County, moving just from 4% to about 5.5%, what you see is a significant concentration of the Asian population in this community, running from the Ohio State University campus out to Dublin, which had historically been the center of the Asian community. However, it is also shifting. Northland, New Albany, and Far East Columbus have seen dramatic increases in the Asian population. This is a new trend, particularly Northland is a new center of growth for the Asian community. As we look at diversity and want to understand why are some places diverse and other places are homogeneous, the most diverse place in all of Franklin County is an area of the far west side of Columbus, just outside 270 and south of West Broad Street. While the white population is about 44%, people who identify as Hispanic, that could be of white or Black, is about 30%. Both other and Black are running around 21%, or people who identify as 2 or more races, 11%. What we continue to see are some of the newer areas of the city, meaning newer housing stock, portions of the community that had been built in the post-World War II era. These are the places that are showing the greatest amount of diversity. And it is the older portions, the inner ring suburbs, where Upper Arlington, south of Lane, is the least diverse place in all of Franklin County. And while the white population there has dropped slightly, it really represents housing policies and patterns of many decades previously. And this is where the context around history really matters and how it shapes our neighborhoods of today. Arlington was built in a period of restrictive covenants. And those restrictive covenants were on property deeds that really appealed to middle and upper income white suburbanites at the time. And what you can see in that marketing brochure is that when the 1,000 acres was launched by King Thompson Company for the areas south of Lane Avenue, they were restricted. And what does that mean if they were restricted? In the book, Planning for the Private Interest, written by Patricia Burgess about residential patterns and restrictive covenants, identified that this was not just a tool that suburban communities used, it was something that happened both in the city of Columbus and in those suburban communities. And in fact, nearly 70% of all the subdivisions that were built in the first half of last century had those kind of restrictions. You can see on the slide, those common exclusions, those were the terms that were used and written in those restrictive covenants that prohibited people of different races to have access to certain parts of our community. And those older portions of Clintonville or Worthington, Grandview, and Arlington are a function in 2021 of the historical pattern that led to discrimination starting back in the 1930s. And while there were restrictive covenants that prevented access, there was also another tool by the Homeowner Loan Corporation that would give banks and insurance companies the opportunity to have confidence to lend to certain areas. And there were other parts of Columbus that were deemed hazardous, not because there were hazardous conditions of having nearby factories, which was sometimes the case, but other neighborhoods were deemed hazardous because of the people who lived in those areas. This is actually a photograph from one of those HOLC assessors tools that called the area of East Long Street between Hamilton and Garfield hazardous, not because of physical conditions, but because of the race of people who lived there. In fact, that tool, which created redlined maps, and what you see here is the historic map for this community. In green would be the areas that would be considered the most credit safe. Those areas you see here in the pink color are those that were considered the most credit risk. Research now suggests that even in the period from 1980 to today, some communities continue to build wealth, while other communities are not able to build wealth based on these historical patterns of discrimination. We know that this still is impacting urban neighborhoods because when you compare the historic map of discrimination on the left, again, those areas in the pink color were those that were deemed hazardous, those areas in yellow were those that were deemed at risk, and in green were those that were considered most valuable: Arlington, Clintonville, Bexley. When you compare the map on the left with the map on the right that was created by the Ohio State University in 2010, what you see is a map of where the private sector has been issuing high cost loans, buy here, pay here. It's where the foreclosure crisis started, and it continues to be neighborhoods that are plagued by many of the social ills of 2020, which are really rooted in the denying of credit from the 1930s. What we also now know to be true is that family income is one of the strongest predictors that measures success in both the classroom and later in life. And the new Poverty Innovation Center and the Poverty Blueprint of Franklin County really began to identify this with a net wealth study from 2016. What you see here are the 5 highest tracts of net wealth for 15 to 24-year-olds. And you can see back to that same area, Upper Arlington, south of Lane, where 15 to 24-year-olds are already starting out in life with $573,000 in net wealth. But yet in Franklinton and Mount Vernon Avenue, or south of Maine, many areas that were originally redlined, young people are starting out with very little. As you transition 40 years later, what you see are the areas of high net wealth were able to build significant more wealth over time, yet some of those areas in the center of the city that were redlined have not been able to build wealth as they head into that last 10 years of earning potential before retirement. Income inequality in Franklin County starts off for young people at 72 to 1. And by the time you're getting close to retirement, it becomes 250 to 1. As we move into the narrative of what's happening with the change of our neighborhoods, there's a lot of conversation around gentrification and displacement. And I will suggest to you that I think we spend too much time on gentrification and not enough time on displacement. There was a tool that was created by the Institute of Metropolitan Opportunity out of the Minnesota Law School that looked at a 16-year window of every single census tract in our community to really gauge what neighborhoods are experiencing gentrification and what neighborhoods are experiencing displacement. And here's the map they created. The areas in blue are the areas where you see the most significant gentrification. The areas in red and peach are the areas that are getting poorer. If you don't see color on this map, that means that that area was either wealthy in 2000 and it was still wealthy by 2016, or it was poor in 2000 and still poor by 2016. The reality is just 4% of Columbus neighborhoods were experiencing gentrification, and that was mainly along the High Street spine, north and south of downtown, but 43% of neighborhoods were getting poorer. The reality is there's 10 times more neighborhoods getting poorer than getting wealthy, but everybody is experiencing an increase in their housing costs. And the gentrification narrative, which is easy for many of us to understand because there are victims and there are villains, displacement is harder to understand because displacement is my income is not going up as fast as my housing costs, and I can no longer afford to live where I am, or I can no longer afford to move where I want. And in places like Northland, housing costs are going up for everybody, despite the fact that Northland has been getting poorer. Northland is not experiencing gentrification, but there's more and more low-income people competing against each other for a finite supply of housing. And here's where we're going to end our conversation today around all of this population growth and neighborhood change is rooted in some critical community conditions. We have been chronically underbuilding housing every year for the last decade. Last year, we saw the most amount of construction we have ever seen in Columbus in 15 years, and it was not enough. Most analysts now say we need 14,000 to 21,000 units built every year just to meet our population growth. Every year for the last decade, we were stuck at 8,000 units until last year when nearly 12,000 units was constructed. When you compare Columbus to our peer cities that are about our population size, what's happening with production in Austin and Nashville and Charlotte dwarfs that of Columbus. Raleigh has 800,000 less people than Columbus, but is producing about 5,000 more units a year. We need much more construction in order to meet our population growth. This has now resulted in a critical scarcity of available housing stock across all price points and all types of housing, from rents to single-family homes. We are no stranger to all of the reports about Columbus being a desirable housing market, but by the summer of 2021, we had tied 3 other markets for having the fastest selling homes, and 60% of all homes were selling for over asking price. This is the result of considerable population growth and chronic underbuilding. In the last 24 months, the sale price of a Columbus home jumped almost $62,000. This is an unsustainable growth. The prediction is that over the next 12 months, we will see a comparable increase. These increases compounded over time are resulting in a housing challenge that is soon to become a housing crisis for Central Ohio. This is the current average selling price of all homes in the Columbus market. What you see in red are all of those places that are running considerably higher than the Franklin County median. In the light blue, you're seeing the communities that are running around the county median, and in the dark blue would be those communities that are selling for below the county median. These are price points, the likes of which we have never seen in Central Ohio. They're unsustainable, and they no longer match the incomes of those that live here. The scarcity of production and the rapid population growth is also causing a strain on the rental housing market, where we are seeing significant increases in the price of a median 2-bedroom apartment. This is also resulting in a huge reduction in the supply of affordable apartments. According to the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio, we've lost nearly 20,000 affordable rental units in a 2-year window, as units that used to be renting for a more modest monthly price have been pushed up as landlords are able to get more and more for those rents because of the increased demand. This has resulted in 54,000 households paying more than half of their income for housing. With the eviction moratoriums running out and a significant number of vulnerable households, every time a household in Franklin County loses their housing, it costs this community over $7,000 to get that person in temporary housing, provide services, and linkage and referral to a new home. We have not seen an increase in the support from the federal government to address this homelessness and housing shortage in 4 years. The result is the housing stock we are building and how our city is changing no longer match up, and they haven't matched up for some time, as local zoning codes and building regulations are really forcing the hands of many developers to really build a housing product the market no longer needs. We need a far greater diversity of housing to match the kind of households that we have been adding and will continue to add over the next several decades. Coupled with this was a huge reduction in vacant and abandoned housing units across Franklin County. In fact, what concerns me the most is that we now have 9,400 less vacant units than we did 10 years ago. By 2020, the housing vacancy rate here was lower than that of San Francisco County, and we no longer have that inventory of vacant and abandoned housing to bring back online. And over the last decade, the vacant housing that was brought back online enabled about 22,000 additional people to live in this community because we had an existing inventory of housing in places like Northland and Linden and the Near East Side that were brought back and allowed people to move into those units. Now that that inventory is gone, if the rate of population growth continues in this region, and if we cannot increase production, we will have a far more significant increase in home costs for both for sale and rental at a much faster rate than what we've experienced. In Kevin Cox's book, he does say that we are an anomaly, that we are a rapidly growing, developing city in a part of the country that really has not expanded at all. And we're much more like Austin and Denver than we are like Cleveland and Cincinnati. And we are, in fact, the closest thing that Ohio has and will ever have to a Sunbelt city. There are parts of this region that are barely recognizable in less than a generation. Places like Dublin, which have gone from a small village to a large city in a relatively short period of time. And you just have to drive around Columbus to see this. Here's a street in my neighborhood in Wineland Park in 2011. There's that same view in 2020. We see it on Long Street in downtown Columbus at the beginning of the decade and what that street looks like today. We see it in the Short North, in the heart of the Short North at the beginning of the decade, and the same view today. Or at the corner of Summit and the Fifth Avenue corridor, and what it looks like today. There are now 10 mid-rise buildings under construction or planned and proposed between Grant Avenue and Olentangy River Road, just on Fifth Avenue. And the reality is no neighborhood is too precious to not take some of the growth. Neighborhood groups in urban neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods, and outside the county are fighting density, and they are fighting growth. We will add another 1 million people by 2050, and our neighborhoods are going to continue to change. How we meet that change is going to be very critical over the next decade, because we will have to build more housing, build a more compact city, and build with greater density and build a greater diversity of housing typology in order to meet the growth of the future. We have never been adding people more quickly, and we have never been more diverse or influential than we are now. But the challenges we face as a city and region have never been more complex, they've never been more significant, and they've never been at a more critical decision point. The reality is, suburbs that surround healthy cities will do better than suburbs that surround sick cities. And isolationism on the urban periphery is not a sufficient defense to ignore the challenges of our region. We will sink or swim together. We will need to build more housing and different types of housing. We will need to better understand how our neighborhoods are changing and why some places continue to fall behind. And we will need to be much better prepared to be a much larger city and a more diverse city. But I do have faith that together, the Columbus region will really rise to that occasion. I thank you for joining us today. A lot of numbers and a lot of maps. We value this kind of community knowledge, and all of the maps and data are available to you if you're so interested. And as we continue to move forward as a city, please stay tuned. We'll have more information to share around poverty and children and new Americans as soon as the Census Bureau releases that data. Again, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Thanks.